Two journals lie on the cold metal table in front of me. In mine, I'm the victim, broken by 3 years of torture inside a cage of stone and water. In his, I'm the devil who, with a devilish smile, slowly drove the old man insane. The detective looks at me and doesn't ask questions. He just waits to see which of my personalities will confess first. The problem is, I no longer know which one of them is real. Interrogation room 3 reeked of disinfectant and other people's fear. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead in monotonous, endless drone, flooding the space with corpse-white illumination. No shadows here, no shelter. David Monroe sat at the metal table, hands hidden beneath its cold surface, fingers laced together. Clammy. He couldn't make them stay still, so he kept them out of sight. His light brown hair, unwashed for 2 days, stuck to his forehead. Dark circles hung beneath his pale gray eyes, remnants of sleepless nights at the Lighthouse and here in the holding cell. The navy wool sweater that had been his uniform in isolation hung loose on his gaunt frame. The door opened. Detective Carlyle entered. Broad-shouldered, weary man with a square face and dark brown eyes drained of light. He offered no greeting, just moved toward the table with the heavy, measured gait of someone who'd walked this path 1,000 times. In his hands, he carried 2 leather-bound books. The detective set them on the table. A dull, weighty thud. The sound hit like a gavel strike. Final. Irrefutable. David stared at the journals, one his own, the other belonging to Elias Crane, and the air in the room thickened, became dense and heavy as the sea fog that wrapped the lighthouse on its darkest nights. Carlyle lowered himself into the chair opposite. Metal whined under his weight. He leaned back, laced his fingers over his stomach, and studied David with a long, impenetrable gaze. That look was worse than accusations. It held no questions, only assessment. David forced himself to breathe evenly. Finally, Carlyle pushed one of the journals across the table with 2 fingers. Leather binding scraped against metal with a whispering sound. "This one's yours, David," the detective said in an even voice. "In here, you're a victim of circumstance, tormented intellectual driven to extremes." Pause. Carlyle tapped a blunt finger on Elias's journal. "And in this one, you're a cold-blooded manipulator who found an old man's weakness and pressed until he broke." Another pause. Longer. Heavier. "Now tell me, which of these stories sounds more believable to people who haven't spent 3 months in isolation?" David unlaced his fingers. Slowly. Carefully. Laid his palms flat on the table, spreading them to show openness. No secrets. Nothing hidden. His throat was dry, and the first word came out hoarse. "My journal isn't a story," he swallowed, gathering strength. "It's a survival log. Elias was sick. His mind was failing. Paranoia was eating him from the inside like rust on metal. He saw enemies in shadows, heard threats in the wind, accused me of things I never did." His voice grew stronger with each word, filling with conviction. "I didn't drive him insane. I just recorded him going insane, trying to preserve my own sanity. It was the only reality I could hold on to." Carlyle grunted, a short, joyless sound closer to a cough. "Reality," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Interesting concept." He pulled cheap reading glasses from his jacket pocket and put them on. That simple gesture transformed him from cop to dispassionate investigator. David felt a stab of fear. A detective driven by emotion might make mistakes. A detective driven by facts wouldn't. Carlyle opened Elias's journal. Pages rustled under his thick thumbs. He found what he was looking for. "Let's look at this from his perspective," Carlyle intoned and began reading. June 14th. He did it again. Stood at the porthole for hours, staring at the ocean, not moving. When I asked what he saw out there, he turned and smiled, but his eyes were empty, like a shark's. He's planning something. The detective looked up. "Were you planning something, David?" The words pierced David, triggering a vivid flash of memory. He was there again, in the cramped living quarters of the Lighthouse, smell of salt and mildew, sound of waves crashing against rocks below. He stood at the round, film-coated porthole, gazing at endless gray water, trying to calm his anxiety with the steady rhythm of tides, and felt a heavy, drilling stare on the back of his neck. He turned around. Elias sat at the table, holding an unlit pipe. His watery blue eyes were fixed on David, not with curiosity, not with friendliness, with primal, animal terror. David tried to diffuse the tension, smiled, offered tea. Elias didn't answer. He stared at him like he wasn't looking at an assistant, but at something dangerous, predatory, pretending to be human. "I was trying to be friendly," David said quietly, speaking more to himself than to the detective. He saw it as a threat. Carlyle removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose with thumb and forefinger, displaying cosmic exhaustion. Friendly. Threat. Those are just words, David. Feelings. They don't leave bruises. He set the glasses on the table. Let's move on to what does. The detective flipped decisively through several dozen pages in Elias's journal. His thumb created a rustling sound, like an approaching storm. He stopped. His gaze lingered on one entry. Carlyle leaned forward, elbows on the table. Here, let's talk about facts, about how your hands touched his body. David froze. Carlyle put his glasses back on. His voice dropped lower, heavier. Each word fell into the room's silence like a stone into a deep well. August 2nd. He pushed me at the spiral staircase. I nearly fell. He pretended it was an accident, mumbled apologies, but I saw his eyes. No remorse in them, only calculation. He's testing how weak I've gotten. He's waiting for his moment. Carlyle went silent, stared at David over the rim of his glasses, waited for a reaction. The lie triggered nausea in David. His memory exploded with a different, true recollection. He was climbing the dark, narrow cast-iron staircase, steps cold and damp under his feet. In his hands, tools for repairing the lighthouse mechanism, heavy toolbox. He looked up. Elias was descending from above. The old man filled the entire narrow space of the spiral staircase. Broad shoulders, heavy footfall. He stopped 2 steps above David, blocking the way, and grabbed his forearm. The grip was unexpectedly strong. The old man's fingers dug into his arm like steel clamps. David smelled sour tobacco and unwashed body. Saw madness in watery eyes dilated to unnatural size. Elias hissed in his face, spittle flying. "Don't turn your back on me in my house. Ever." Voice low, full of venom. David returned to the present. His heart hammered. He flinched involuntarily and unconsciously rubbed his forearm, where he could swear phantom finger marks still remained. A fleeting, genuine movement. Carlyle saw it. The detective's expression didn't change, but for an instant, a predatory gleam flashed in his dark eyes. He made a brief, almost imperceptible note in his worn notebook. David saw it, understood. His honest trauma response had just been entered into the record as evidence of guilt. Panic began flooding him, cold and sticky as seawater at high tide. He felt the ground disappearing beneath his feet. In desperation, he made the critical mistake. Went all in. David pointed a trembling finger at his own journal. Everything written there is absolute, literal truth. His voice broke into a shout. Every event, every date, every threat from Elias. You can verify it against any documents, against the Lighthouse logbook, against the supply boat records. These aren't just my memories. This is a chronicle. This is my only defense. He was breathing hard, and it's flawless. Carlyle nodded slowly. His face expressed nothing but mild boredom. He'd seen hundreds of suspects swearing to their innocence, seen them break, seen truth seep through cracks in their stories. Flawless, the detective repeated thoughtfully. Good word. He lazily picked up David's journal and casually flipped through it. Pages rustled. David saw his own neat calligraphic handwriting, small, perfectly even, with perfect spacing between letters. It was his pride, his proof of order in chaos. Carlyle stopped at one entry. Here, for instance, July 23rd. Interesting entry. He read in monotone, like reciting a shopping list. July 23rd. This morning, Elias discovered someone had moved the canned goods in the pantry. He flew into a rage, ran around the kitchen threatening me with a new carving knife with a black plastic handle, shouted that I was deliberately disrupting his order, that I was trying to drive him insane. I locked myself in my room until evening. Carlyle looked up. Very vivid detail. Black plastic handle. He paused. David waited, tense as a drawn bow. The only problem, David, the detective continued matter-of-factly, is that according to the logbook of the supply boat Sea Maiden, a shipment of new kitchen supplies, including that very knife set, was delivered to the Lighthouse only on the morning of July 24th. Carlyle closed the journal. Small thing, of course. The last phrase sounded casual. For David, it was an explosion. He froze. In his head, deafening white noise. The hum of fluorescent lights transformed into crashing surf. The room's walls began closing in. He remembered that knife vividly, cold blade flashing in kerosene lamplight. Black plastic handle, new, without scratches. Elias waving it, his face twisted with rage. David remembered the sticky fear as he backed toward the door. Remembered his spine hitting wood. Remembered his hands shaking as they turned the key in the lock. That memory was as real as the table he sat at. But the irrefutable fact Carlyle had just dropped turned his most vivid memory into a lie. David opened his mouth, closed it. His throat constricted. Carlyle watched silently as certainty drained from David's face, leaving only a mask of pure horror. The detective felt no satisfaction, felt nothing at all. This was work. Just another crack in another story. David clenched his fists under the table, nails dug into palms. If his mind was lying to him about details, maybe it was lying about everything else. The thought was unbearable. He began hoarsely. I remember the knife. I remember it clearly. I don't doubt it, Carlyle replied calmly. Human memory is remarkable. It can create vivid, convincing pictures of events that never happened, especially under the pressure of stress and isolation. He leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers over his stomach. The question isn't whether you remember. The question is whether it actually happened. David stared at his journal, his flawless chronicle, his only proof of sanity. One small error, one detail out of place, and the entire structure began to crumble. The room grew colder. The hum of lights filled the silence. Carlyle pulled a ballpoint pen from his pocket and clicked it once. Click. Sharp, irritating sound. I have time, David, the detective said evenly. All day, all week, if necessary. We'll go through every entry in your journal, every date, every detail. Click. and see how many more small things we find. David closed his eyes. His breathing faltered. He felt like a drowning man being pulled slowly, inexorably underwater. He'd fought his whole life for order, for precision, for control over chaos. His intellect was his only weapon, his memory, his only refuge. Now both were betraying him. He opened his eyes and saw Carlyle watching him with the indifferent patience of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. 2 journals lay on the table between them. 2 conflicting narratives. 2 mirror reflections of the same story. And David Monroe, cornered in a white, soulless room, understood that the duel had only just begun. Silence. Carlyle said nothing after the knife revelation. He leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers over his stomach, and watched David with the unshakable patience of a man who had all day, all month, all the time in the world. David sat motionless, his mind white noise. He desperately tried to find a logical explanation for the date discrepancy. Maybe he'd confused deliveries. Maybe the knife was from a previous shipment and the details had blurred together. But the more he searched for explanations, the deeper he sank into contradictions. Cold blade, black plastic handle, new, without a single scratch. The memory was so vivid, so real. Carlyle pulled a ballpoint pen from his jacket pocket and opened his worn notebook, began making notes, methodical, measured. The sound of pen on paper seemed deafening in the oppressive silence. The scratching, scraping sound bored into David's ears like sandpaper on exposed nerve. Click. Carlyle retracted the pen. Click. Extended it again. Each sound a small torture. David understood the tactic. Silence was a more effective tool than any questions. Carlyle was waiting for David to start destroying his own defense from within, tormented by the need to fill the void with words, explanations, justifications. David clenched his jaw and stayed silent. 1 minute passed. 2. 5. The hum of fluorescent lights transformed into a roar inside his skull. Finally, Carlyle looked up. His face expressed nothing but mild thoughtfulness. "People under stress mix up dates, David," he said casually. "That's understandable. But they rarely invent entire events." He opened Elias's journal, flipped through several pages. "Let's talk about the flower." The detective's finger found the entry he wanted. September 12th. He ruined our last bag of flour, dumped it on the floor while I was checking the generator, said it was an accident. I know he's lying. He wants us to starve, wants me weakened so he can do what he's planning. Carlyle looked up, his dark eyes motionless. "Did you dump the flour, David?" "No." The word came out hoarse because his throat was dry. "No," David repeated more firmly. "That's absurd. Why would I destroy our food? I'd starve right along with him." "Interesting question," Carlyle agreed, his expression unchanged. "Why would you?" David desperately tried to grasp the memory of that day. It slipped away like smoke through fingers. He remembered a storm. A fierce, violent storm in mid-September, wind howling like a living thing trying to tear the tower from the cliff, the lighthouse trembling under its assault. He remembered descending the spiral staircase, steps cold beneath his feet, kerosene lamp swinging in his hand, throwing wild shadows across stone walls. He entered the kitchen and saw Elias. The old man stood in the middle of the room, head to toe covered in white flour, looking like a deranged ghost. Flour in his gray hair, in his mustache, on his hands. Empty sack lying on the floor. Flour everywhere, on the table, on chairs. Thick layer on the stone floor. Elias was screaming, his voice breaking into a shriek. "Poison! Poison in the grain!
He poisoned us!
But beyond that, the memory blurred. Had David been in the room when the bag fell, or had he arrived after? What did he do? What did he say? Details smeared like wet ink in rain. The stress and sleep deprivation of recent months had turned his memories into a kaleidoscope of disconnected images that wouldn't form a complete picture. "You don't look certain, David," Carlyle observed, setting Elias's journal aside. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. The detective stretched, his spine cracking. He winced from chronic lower back pain, then straightened. "Let's try something you should remember clearly. An event you both described very vividly." Pause. "The incident with the canned stew." David tensed. Every muscle in his gaunt body contracted. Instinctively, he braced for another assault on his reality, another blow to the fragile structure of his memory. Carlyle took his time. He methodically opened Elias's journal, found the right page. His finger slid down the text like he was following a shopping list. October 1st. He ate the last can of stew. When I asked him about it, he smiled and said, "Rats got it." I found the empty can under his bunk. I went to him to demand an explanation. He grabbed the gaff. He wanted to kill me. I barely got away. Each word Carlyle spoke sounded like a verdict being read in a courtroom. "Did you grab the gaff, David?" "No!" David's voice broke into a shout. Elias's version was so monstrously false, such a perverted distortion of truth, that it broke through the fog in David's memory. A recollection overwhelmed him, the brightest, clearest of the entire interrogation. The Lighthouse's round kitchen. Stone walls covered in condensation. Cast iron stove in the corner with something sizzling in a pan. Fried onions. The last onions from their meager supplies. Smell acrid, sweetish, mixed with salt and kerosene. Elias stood at the table. In his hands, an empty stew can. His face red with rage, veins bulging in his neck.
"You ate it!"
he screamed, shaking the can.
"You stole the last can!"
David backed away, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Elias, I didn't take it. We ate it together 2 days ago, remember? You opened it yourself." But Elias couldn't hear. He was beyond hearing. Madness was devouring his mind. The old man threw the can. It hit the floor with a dull thud. His hand reached for the corner where the fishing gaff stood, a heavy tool with a long wooden handle and a steel hook on the end, sharp as a razor. Elias lifted it. David retreated. His back hit the cold stone wall between the table and doorway. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Elias came toward him. Slowly, inexorably. Gaff raised, kerosene lamplight sliding across the lethal steel hook. "You want to kill me," the old man hissed. "Starve me. But I won't let you. I'll protect my lighthouse." The hook descended. David dodged. Cold metal whipped past his face, so close he felt the displaced air. The point scraped the stone wall behind him, striking a spark. The memory was so real, so vivid, that David choked in the sterile interrogation room. His lungs seized. He couldn't breathe. Air became solid mass that wouldn't pass his throat. David gripped the edge of the metal table. His knuckles went white. Nails bitten to the quick dug into cold metal. He didn't see Carlyle sitting there in his rumpled jacket. He saw Elias's mad, watery eyes. Saw the hook raised above his head. His chest burned, heart hammered, trying to break free of his ribs. "Breathe, David," Carlyle said evenly. The detective's voice was distant, as if coming through deep water. "Slowly. In. Out." David forced himself to inhale. Air entered convulsively. painfully. He blinked. The lighthouse kitchen vanished. He was in the white room again, back under the merciless light. Carlyle watched him with an impassive face. He'd seen David's reaction, seen pure, undiluted terror, and understood that for David, this memory was absolutely real. The detective leaned back in his chair, closed Elias's journal and set it aside, picked up David's journal. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less dangerous. "I believe you were frightened, David." Pause. "But your journal doesn't." Carlyle opened the book to the right page. His finger found the October 1st entry. "You write, Elias flew into a rage again, threatened me with the gaff. That's it." The detective looked up. Where's the fear? Where's the terror? Where's the desperation? Where's any emotion at all? He tapped his finger on the neat, calligraphic lines. This isn't the record of a victim fighting for survival. This is a coroner's report documenting a corpse. The words hit David harder than any accusation of lying. He stared at his journal, at the perfectly even handwriting, at the impeccable lines, at the detached clinical language. He'd always prided himself on his capacity for rational analysis, for detached observation. He'd thought that's what saved his sanity at the Lighthouse, that keeping the journal was a way to maintain distance between himself and the madness surrounding him. But now Carlyle was turning everything upside down. What if that detachment wasn't a defense mechanism, but his true nature? What if he'd recorded events with cold curiosity, not because he was fighting fear, but because he felt none at all? For the first time in his life, David was looking at himself from the outside, and he didn't recognize the person he saw. "Why is there no fear here?" Carlyle asked quietly. "The door to your emotions is locked tight. Why, David?" David's voice trembled. "I had to maintain clarity of thought. If I'd let myself panic—" "Or," Carlyle interrupted, "you recorded events the way you saw them, coldly, dispassionately, because that's exactly what you are." The detective closed the journal. Victim or cold-blooded psychopath? The question remains open. Silence fell between them, heavy as a tombstone. David couldn't answer. His own nature had become a mystery to him. He was losing not just memory of events at the Lighthouse, he was losing understanding of himself. Carlyle pulled a pack of gum from his pocket, unwrapped a piece, and put it in his mouth. Chewed slowly, deliberately, looking somewhere off to the side, as if David had ceased to be interesting. Finally, the detective sighed. Deeply, wearily. "All right, David. Maybe you're right. Maybe the old man just went crazy." For a moment, a spark of hope flared in David's chest. Weak, flickering, but hope nonetheless. Carlyle continued without looking at him. "I spoke with his daughter, Rebecca Crane. She lives upstate. Hasn't seen her father in over 5 years. She mentioned there was a predisposition to early onset dementia on the male side of their family. Her grandfather started losing his mind at 60. David grabbed onto this information like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. An explanation. Simple, logical, medical explanation that lifted the burden of guilt and made his story plausible. Elias had been sick. His brain was deteriorating, not from external influence, but from genetic predisposition. David had been witness to tragedy, not its cause. "See?" The words burst from him with relief. "I told you. He was sick. His mind—" "Hold on," Carlyle cut him off, raising his hand. The detective lazily flipped through his notebook. His face showed nothing, like he was looking for a phone number or address, not holding a man's fate in his hands. "I called Elias's family doctor, Dr. Holloway. Been practicing in the coastal town for 30 years. He confirmed the hereditary history. David waited, holding his breath. Except he said that type of dementia in their family usually manifests after 75, sometimes at 72. Carlyle looked up. Elias was 68. Dr. Holloway examined him 6 months ago, before the season started. Said the old man was healthy as an ox for his age. Sharp mind, solid memory. No signs of cognitive impairment whatsoever. David's hope extinguished as suddenly as it had ignited. He was at a dead end again, without explanations again. Drowning in contradictions he couldn't untangle. Carlyle closed the notebook, put it back in his jacket pocket, stood, stretched, working out stiff muscles. "I need coffee," he said tiredly. "You want water?" David nodded, unable to speak. The detective headed for the door, but stopped halfway. His hand settled on the doorknob. He stood with his back to David, as if speaking into the void. "Funny thing, though." His voice was thoughtful, absent. Dr. Holloway did mention that Elias suffered from severe, almost asthmatic allergies to certain types of mold. Fungal spores. Said he needed a dry climate, but the Lighthouse had high humidity year-round. The old man kept an inhaler with him in case of attacks. Carlyle shrugged. "Guess he managed." He opened the door and left, leaving David alone in the white, humming room. David sat motionless. Allergy to mold. The information seemed completely irrelevant. A medical detail with no connection to events at the Lighthouse. Carlyle had mentioned it in passing, as if filling silence with a random observation. But something in those words snagged at David. Something elusive that flickered at the periphery of consciousness and vanished before he could grasp it. Allergy to mold. Humidity at the Lighthouse. Inhaler. Fragments of information floated in his exhausted mind, refusing to form a complete picture. The door behind Carlyle closed with the dull click of an electronic lock. David was left alone with 2 journals on the table, white noise in his head, and a new, inexplicable unease that scratched somewhere deep in his consciousness, like a rat behind a wall. He looked at his hands, at the bitten nails, at the thin white scar at the base of his left thumb, a reminder of childhood, of a broken watch mechanism, of the pain that comes from trying to understand how the world works. His mind was that same broken mechanism, and David no longer understood how it worked. Carlyle stood. He said nothing, didn't cast a final glance, just rose heavily as if under the weight of lived years and witnessed crimes, and headed for the door. David watched him go, paralyzed. The door opened, closed, click of the lock. The sound was heavy, final. Not just a closed door, a sealed trap. Carlyle hadn't left him here to rest, hadn't left him for a breather. He'd left him here to stew in his own juices, to let doubt corrode him from within like acid. David sat motionless in the white, humming room. He was alone, locked in. His reality was shattered, and the enemy, a detective who seemed to understand his mind better than he did himself, had vanished, leaving only unanswered questions. The room contracted. Walls moved closer. Silence became physical, pressing against eardrums until it hurt. David looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He laced his fingers together, squeezed them, trying to stop the tremor. It didn't help. Complete despair washed over him, cold and clammy. He had lost. But amid that despair, deep in his consciousness, where the researcher lived, the archivist, the man trained to analyze and systematize, a spark ignited. David raised his gaze to the table. 2 journals lay before him, open like an invitation. They were the cause of his suffering, but they were also all he had left, the only tool he understood. Carlyle had caught him in an error, one small date discrepancy that shattered his certainty. But what if Elias's journal also contained errors? What if there were more mistakes? Elias had been insane. His mind was deteriorating. His entries should be full of contradictions, inconsistencies, gaps in logic. David would find them. He knew how to do this. It was his strength, attention to detail, ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. A plan formed in his head, clear and sharp. David felt a surge of adrenaline. Weak, but real. He couldn't beat Carlyle in a psychological duel. The detective was too experienced, too ruthless. But he could beat him as a researcher. He could find proof, a fact, irrefutable evidence that would demolish the accusation. David pulled both journals toward himself, laid them side by side on the metal surface, opened them to matching dates, early June, the very first entries after his arrival at the Lighthouse. For a moment, he felt like himself again. Not a suspect sitting under interrogation room lights. Not a victim or a psychopath. An archivist. A researcher. A man who worked with documents, with facts, with cold, tangible reality. His breathing steadied. Shoulders straightened. David began working, methodically, meticulously. He cross-referenced weather entries. Elias had been an experienced sailor. He recorded wind direction, sea conditions, approaching storms. David compared this data with his own observations. They matched. He switched to meal times. Elias mentioned breakfasts, lunches. David checked dates, menus, details. They matched. Lighthouse maintenance work, cleaning the lamp room lens, lubricating the rotation mechanism, checking the generator. They matched. An hour passed unnoticed. David had flipped through dozens of pages, and his growing confidence began to crack. There were no errors. Moreover, the longer he read, the more he was gripped by cold, sticky fear. The entries were frighteningly symmetrical. If David wrote, "Repaired the lamp rotation mechanism today," Elias watched me all day with suspicion. Then Elias wrote that same day, "He fiddled with the mechanism all day. I saw him removing parts, studying them. Afraid he wants to break it, to leave us in darkness." If David recorded, "Offered Elias help carrying firewood," he refused rudely. Then Elias wrote, "He tried to take my axe, said he wanted to help. I didn't let him. It's a trap." Every action David described as routine, assistance, or an attempt to make contact became, in Elias's journal, part of a sinister, carefully calculated plan. David accelerated his pace. His movements became feverish. Pages rustled under his fingers. He jumped from date to date, week to week, desperately searching for one crack, one inconsistency. July, August, September. Nothing. Not a single missed day. Not a single factual error. Not a single discrepancy in events. The stories were perfectly mirrored. Each a distorted, perverted version of the other. The same reality told by two diametrically opposed voices. Hope gave way to panic. This was wrong. Completely wrong. Records by two different people, one of whom was insane, couldn't be this consistent. A madman can't keep a journal with such precision. He forgets dates, confuses events, contradicts himself. But there was none of that. Before David lay a carefully constructed, diabolically logical structure, where every detail fit with another, like parts of a clockwork mechanism. David felt his sanity beginning to crack at the seams. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold the pages. He reached October. Entries grew shorter, more fragmented. Elias wrote about mounting threat, about how David was closing in. David wrote about the old man's growing paranoia, outbursts of aggression, fear for his life. And then, the great storm. Late October, David remembered that night, remembered it more clearly than any other event at the lighthouse. He found his entry. The handwriting was shakier than usual, as if his hand had trembled while writing. Storm of unprecedented force. Waves reaching the top of the cliff. Wind threatening to tear the tower from its foundation. Elias completely lost his mind. Accused me of summoning the storm, of calling dark forces. Locked me outside on the gallery. I pounded on the door until my hands were bloody. I thought I would die. With trembling hands, David turned the page in Elias's journal. Found the same date. The entry was brief. Furious. Letters scratching the paper like a knife. The storm came for him. I saw it. The sea boiled like hell, opening its mouth. I locked the door so it couldn't reach me. He pounded, screamed, like a demon being dragged to the underworld. The light won't go out. I'll protect the lighthouse. Reading these lines hurled David into the most terrifying flashback. He was there again, on the narrow exterior gallery at the top of the lighthouse. Metal railings slippery with ice-cold water and salt. The gallery circled the lamp room, but it was barely 3 feet wide. On one side, the glass wall of the lighthouse. On the other, the abyss. Wind howled like a living thing, full of rage and hunger. It tried to tear David from the railing, throw him down into the boiling blackness of the ocean. Icy spray from waves struck his face, blinding him. Salt water penetrated under his clothes, chilled him to the bone. David couldn't breathe. Each inhale, a struggle against a wall of wind. He saw through thick glass the distorted face of Elias inside the lamp room. The old man shouted something at him, but no words could be heard over the roar of the elements. His mouth opened and closed. His eyes were mad. David desperately pounded on the heavy iron door. His fists were torn. Blood mixed with seawater on metal. But the sound of his blows drowned in the storm's thunder. Elias didn't hear, or didn't want to hear. A wave rose higher than the cliff. David saw it, a black wall of water tall as a house, crowned with white foam. It crashed down on the lighthouse. The icy mass struck the gallery, swept him off his feet. David clung to the railing. His fingers slipped on wet metal. Another second, and he'd be swept into the ocean. He screamed, but the wind tore the sound from his throat. Cold penetrated deeper than skin, deeper than bones. He felt it in his heart, in his lungs, in his very soul. This wasn't just fear. This was absolute certainty of death. David returned to the interrogation room. His teeth chattered. His whole body shook with phantom cold. Sweat covered his forehead, but he was freezing, as if still standing on that cursed gallery. The memory left him hollow, completely broken. This wasn't Elias's paranoia. This was attempted murder. The old man had locked him out there, knowing the storm could kill him, using the ocean as a weapon. David closed his eyes, tried to steady his breathing. He had lost. He wouldn't find salvation in the journal's content, wouldn't find proof of his innocence or Elias's madness. Carlyle would return, and David would have nothing but the same stories the detective had already torn apart. David sat staring at 2 open pages. His gaze went unfocused. He no longer read the words, didn't process their meaning. He just looked at the lines, at black marks on yellowed paper, faded from time and moisture. And then, in this state of detached despair, his archivist's mind, trained by years of work with documents, accustomed to noticing the smallest details, watermarks, faded ink, barely visible corrections, made one last, unconscious effort. He stopped seeing what was written and began seeing how it was written. Form, structure, the handwriting itself. His gaze caught on one letter in his own neat handwriting, the letter D. It had a characteristic, barely noticeable flourish at the top of the vertical stroke. A small curlicue, a habit he'd never been able to break. He didn't even realize he did it. Just an automatic movement of the hand. David slowly, as if afraid to spook a vision, shifted his gaze to the adjacent page. Elias's journal. The handwriting furious, slanted. Letters uneven, scratching the paper, almost unrecognizable. He found the same letter, D, and saw it, the same one. Unique, unmistakable. Flourish. Time stopped. Blood drained from David's face. He felt nausea rising from his stomach. No, this was impossible. With a trembling finger, he began comparing other letters. B. In his handwriting, it was neat, rounded. In Elias's handwriting, angry, angular. But the foundation was the same. The way the pen began forming the loop, the angle of the vertical line. F. Same story, different styles, one structure. T. R. G. Again and again, the styles were completely different. One restrained, calligraphic, controlled. The other jagged, angry, insane. But the skeleton of the letters was identical. Distance between strokes, pen pressure on paper. Barely noticeable flourishes and curlicues that form not consciously, but at the level of muscle memory, as if the same person had written with left and right hands, or tried to forge handwriting. His own handwriting. David dropped the journals on the table. His hands shook so violently he couldn't control them. Truth crashed down on him like that wave on the Lighthouse gallery. Undeniable. Physical. Written in his own hand. He had written both journals. Every entry by Elias. Every accusation. Every furious phrase about conspiracy, about betrayal, about approaching threat. He had written them himself. All his struggle of recent months. All his fear. His enemy, the insane old man who'd turned the lighthouse into hell. The monster Elias who'd tried to kill him. It was all a lie. A lie he'd created himself and believed. David made a sound, not a scream, not a moan, but something in between. An animal sound of a man whose reality had just ceased to exist. He wasn't just a killer defending himself from a madman. He was the madman. He was so insane that he'd created an entire war on paper, written two opposing narratives, conducted a dialogue with himself, distributing roles of victim and monster between two versions of the same person, and didn't even remember it. His mind had split, fractured reality into two incompatible stories, and forced him to believe one, hiding the other somewhere in dark depths of his subconscious. David stared at his hands. These hands had written both journals. These hands had possibly killed Elias. And he didn't remember, didn't understand, didn't control. His identity, his entire self, built on intellect, on control, on ability to analyze and understand, had just ceased to exist. David Monroe, archivist, researcher, man who believed in facts and truth, was dead. In his place remained emptiness, and in that emptiness was only one question he couldn't answer. Who was he really? David didn't move. He sat in the white room, staring at his hands. They lay on the table before him, lifeless, as if severed from his body. Thin fingers, bitten nails, thin white scar at the base of his thumb, memory of a broken watch mechanism from childhood. These hands had written both journals. These hands had lied to him for months. These hands had possibly killed a man, and he didn't remember. The villain wasn't Elias, not Carlyle. The villain lived inside him, in the tangled neural pathways of his own brain, which had betrayed him in the most sophisticated, most cruel way. All his memories, vivid, distinct images of Elias wielding the gaff, locking the door, screaming accusations, turned to dust. Not facts, not truth, just hallucinations of a mind fractured into two warring halves. David felt his identity disintegrating. Archivist, researcher, man who'd built his identity on intellect and precision. Everything collapsed. In place of David Monroe remained an empty shell. He had lost. Icy, hollow resignation flooded him. He no longer fought, no longer searched for evidence, no longer built a defense. He just sat in sterile silence and waited. Charges. Prison. Psychiatric ward. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. David slowly pushed both journals away from himself. They slid across the metal table surface with a quiet whisper of leather on metal. He didn't want to see them anymore. Didn't want to read those lying pages, written by his hand in moments he couldn't remember. Evidence of his madness. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, listened to distant sounds of the police station filtering through thick walls. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, measured. Someone walking past. Muffled telephone ring. Voices. Indistinct, distorted by distance. Sounds of another life. Real life to which he no longer belonged. David opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling. Fluorescent lights hummed monotonously, their illumination blurring in his unfocused vision, becoming a milky smear. He no longer tried to analyze, didn't try to remember, didn't try to understand. The fight was over. Time flowed past him, viscous and meaningless. Minutes? Hours? He couldn't distinguish. David's gaze lowered, aimlessly, mechanically, slid across the table, along the gray wall, to the corner of the room where paint peeled in thin flakes, stopped on an open page of Elias's journal. He didn't read the words, didn't process their meaning, just looked at black lines on yellowed paper like an abstract pattern. Ink strokes, space between letters, texture of old paper slightly warped from moisture. And precisely because he was no longer searching for meaning, he noticed the anomaly. Physical, visual. In places where ink lay especially thick, on heavy periods at the ends of sentences, on flourishes of capital letters, in crossed-out words, the paper was darker. Not just from ink. There were tiny, web-like dark brown spots. They spread from the center of each ink droplet like microscopic roots penetrating paper fibers. David frowned. These spots seemed vaguely familiar. He'd seen something similar before. Long ago, in another life. Memory stirred, slow and reluctant. University. Special collections reading room. Old manuscripts in glass cases, and one 17th century book he'd been allowed to examine under the curator's supervision. The pages had been covered with similar dark spots. The archivist had explained, mold, fungal damage. Spores penetrate paper, feed on glue and cellulose, spread in slow networks. Mold. The word flashed in David's consciousness, and behind it, like an echo, came Detective Carlyle's voice, spoken hours ago in this same room. Dr. Holloway did mention that Elias suffered from severe, almost asthmatic allergies to certain types of mold. That detail had seemed meaningless then, a random medical fact with no relevance to the case. Now it acquired weight. David straightened. His heart beat faster. Mold. Allergy. Spots on paper. A second memory rose from the depths, vivid and clear. The lighthouse. Living quarters. About a year ago, when Elias had still been relatively sane, the supply boat had just delivered provisions. Crates on the stone floor. David helping the old man sort through their contents. Among other things, office supplies. Paper. Pencils. 2 new bottles of ink in glass vials. Elias picked one up, unscrewed the cap, brought it to his nose, grimaced. "Smells musty," the old man grumbled. "Like they pulled it from a flooded basement." David hadn't paid attention then. He'd shrugged. The ink was cheap, standard issue from the Lighthouse service, probably stored in poor conditions at the warehouse. Elias had returned the bottle to the crate with displeasure. "Fine, I'll use the old ones. At least they don't stink." But Elias's old ink ran out within a few weeks. He'd had to open the new bottles, and David had started using them too, for his journal. And later, when his mind began splitting at the seams, for Elias's journal. Musty smell, mold, allergy. 3 disconnected facts collided in David's head and struck a blinding spark of understanding. His brain, trained by years of archival work to find connections, to correlate data, to identify patterns in chaos, activated instantly. Tumblers in a complex lock clicked into place. This wasn't psychology. This was toxicology. David leaned over the table. His fingers trembled as he pulled Elias's journal toward him. Opened it to a page where the ink was especially thick. Looked at the dark spots under the lamplight. Mold in the ink. Some types of mold produced toxins, mycotoxins. He'd read about this while working on his dissertation in a chapter on deterioration of historical documents. Fungal spores entering the body through respiratory tract or skin could cause a wide spectrum of symptoms, including neurological ones, hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, aggression. Elias, with his severe allergy to mold, had been more susceptible. His immune system reacted more strongly. The toxin penetrated his bloodstream faster, reached his brain faster. He'd been the canary in the coal mine, the first victim of poisoned ink. His paranoia, his rage, his accusations. All of it wasn't dementia, wasn't madness in the traditional sense. It was poisoning. And David, trying to preserve his sanity in isolation, had started keeping a journal. Every evening he sat at the table, dipped his pen in the inkwell, and wrote. Inhaled the fumes. Touched the poisoned liquid with his fingers. Slowly, inexorably, the poison accumulated in his system. And when his own mind began fracturing, when reality began warping, he started keeping a second journal, his enemy's journal. Dipping his pen into that same poisoned source again and again. David leaned back in his chair. The horrifying irony of the situation struck him with such force he gasped. He hadn't just been poisoned along with Elias. He'd poisoned himself. With a double dose. Keeping 2 journals, he'd spent twice as much time over the inkwell. Inhaled twice as much toxic fumes in the lighthouse's confined space, where humidity promoted mold growth and ventilation was minimal. He was both victim and his own executioner. His obsession with documentation, the only survival tool, a way to maintain control and sanity, had become the weapon of his self-destruction. Every entry had brought him closer to madness. Every word had been a drop of poison. And worst of all, he remembered the process. Vaguely, in fragments, as through fog, evenings at the table. Kerosene lamp, open inkwell. The smell, acrid, unpleasant. But he'd gotten used to it, stopped noticing. He wrote his journal, in neat calligraphic handwriting. And then, a gap. Fog. Then he wrote again, in different letters, furious, uneven, as Elias, pouring onto paper paranoia that wasn't memory of the old man's words, but an echo of his own poisoned consciousness. 2 voices, 2 narratives, 1 mind fractured by toxin. Realization of this tragic, terrible truth changed everything. The horror of madness receded, replaced by cold, crystalline clarity. David was no longer broken. He'd found what he'd been searching for all this time. A logical, scientific, irrefutable explanation. Not mysticism, not psychology. Chemistry, biology, facts. He wouldn't escape the murder charge. Elias was dead, and David's hands were implicated. He remembered the cliff, the struggle, the fall. Even if it was self-defense, even if both were poisoned, the law wouldn't forgive. But he'd saved something more important: his sanity, his story, his identity. David Monroe was no longer a confused victim of his own madness. He was the bearer of terrible truth about what had really happened at Sorrow Point, the only person who understood. The interrogation room door opened, sound of the metal lock turning, heavy footsteps. Detective Carlyle entered. He carried 2 plastic water bottles and a paper cup of coffee. His face showed bored satisfaction. The mask of a professional finishing routine work. He expected to see a completely broken man. A suspect ready to sign any confession just to end the torment. Carlyle stopped in the doorway, looked at David. David sat with straight back, hands folded on the table, 2 journals lying neatly before him. The detective narrowed his eyes. Something was wrong. Suspects in this state usually sat hunched over, face buried in palms, or rocked back and forth. They didn't sit calmly like students before an exam. Carlyle closed the door, approached the table, set the water and coffee on the edge. "David," he began in an even voice, "I think it's time we finished this conversation. You've been here several hours. You've had time to think." He lowered himself into the chair opposite. "Want to tell me something?" David raised his gaze to him and began laughing. Quietly, soundlessly, shoulders shaking, head thrown back. The laughter was strange. Not the hysterical wail of a madman, not sobs of despair. It was quiet, almost gentle laughter of someone who'd just seen the whole picture. The entire, monstrous, absurd, tragic picture. Carlyle frowned. In 28 years of service, he'd seen hundreds of suspects on the edge of breakdown. This laughter was familiar. Final stage. The moment when the psyche can't withstand the pressure and breaks completely. Cracked, the detective thought with satisfaction. He was wrong. The laughter cut off abruptly. David lowered his head, looked at Carlyle. His pale gray eyes were absolutely clear, calm. No fear remained in them, no panic, no confusion. In them was hard-won, bitter clarity. "You were looking for a liar, detective," David said in an even voice. Carlyle froze. David slowly, without breaking eye contact, extended his hand and pointed at the open page of Elias's journal, at the dark spots around thick ink droplets. "You should have been looking for a poisoner." His finger moved from the page to the closed inkwell sitting among the evidence in the corner of the table, a glass vial with remnants of black liquid at the bottom. "And it's been on your table this whole time." Silence fell into the room, heavy and dense. Carlyle stared at David motionlessly. His face showed nothing, but something new appeared in his dark eyes. Not understanding, not yet, but the first prick of doubt. David didn't look away. He was no longer a frightened suspect. He was a witness, an expert, the only person in this room who understood the truth. Test the ink, he said quietly. Send it to the lab. Run toxicological analysis. Mold spores. Mycotoxins. He paused. Then test my blood. And Elias's blood. David leaned back in his chair. We were both poisoned. For months. Slowly. Inexorably. The poison was in the ink. We breathed it. Touched it. It destroyed our minds from within, turning reality into nightmare. His voice was calm, almost indifferent. Elias, with his allergy, suffered worse, faster. And I tried to preserve my sanity by keeping a journal, and poisoned myself doubly. David looked at his hands. I wrote both journals, that's true, but I don't remember writing the second one. Because during that process, I wasn't myself. I was an echo, a reflection of Elias's madness that I saw and absorbed every day. He raised his gaze to Carlyle. I killed him. Maybe. Probably. I don't remember the moment of his death, but if I did it, it wasn't malice, not calculation. It was two poisoned men on the edge of a cliff, in the final struggle of two minds destroyed by the same poison. David fell silent. Carlyle sat motionless. His face remained impassive, but his fingers slowly reached for the inkwell, took it, brought it to the light. Dark liquid, glass surface covered with a thin film. Mold, the detective repeated quietly. Test it, David said. It's the only way to know the truth. Carlyle set the inkwell on the table, pulled out his notebook, began making notes in his illegible, angular handwriting. Click, click. His ballpoint pen beat out a rhythm. Finally, he looked up. Even if you're right, he said slowly, even if the ink was poisoned, that's not a defense for murder. I understand, David replied calmly, but it's an explanation, and an explanation is all I have. Carlyle closed the notebook, stood. I'll order the analysis. He headed for the door, stopped at the threshold, turned back. If you're right, David, his voice softened, barely noticeably, then you were both victims. Yes, David agreed quietly, but only one of us survived to tell the story. Carlyle left, the door closed. David remained alone in the white room, under the hum of lights. He looked at the two journals before him, no longer saw them as enemies or evidence of madness. He saw tragedy. The story of two men slowly destroyed by invisible poison. David closed his eyes. For the first time in many months, he felt something like peace. Not happiness, not relief, but understanding. And for a man whose entire life had been built on seeking truth, understanding was enough.